Copenhagen, March 1881. Inside a police station near the harbor, a clerk is taking statements. Not from suspects, from witnesses. Hotel owners. Landladies. A man named Mork, who runs a hotel on Nyhavn, the canal street lined with sailors' taverns, explains that a young woman named Johan Botthilde Fredriksson worked for him for a month before moving on to another hotel on Vestergade. He isn't under arrest. He's barely a footnote. But his statement is part of a file the Copenhagen police are building around a contract, one signed 4 months earlier, in November 1880, by a 19-year-old domestic servant named Marie Halvorsdatter. The contract itself is unremarkable. It's the kind of document a Copenhagen hiring office processed routinely. A young woman agrees to work as a maid for a Miss R. Johnson, of Bleecker Street, numbers 22 and 24, New York. 6 months of service. 10 kroner a month. Passage to America paid in full. Except Miss R. Johnson didn't run a household. She ran a hotel. And according to the women who later fled it, that hotel operated as a brothel, and the service they were expected to provide had nothing to do with domestic work. By the time this file lands on a Copenhagen clerk's desk, Regina Johnson is already facing prosecution on the other side of the Atlantic. And what happens next, in Denmark, is where this story gets strange, because this 1881 case, with its paper trail of contracts, hotel statements, and an eventual debate in Parliament, is one of the only Danish white slave trade cases that's actually documented in this kind of detail. And yet, for the next 30 years, Danish newspapers, churches, women's organizations, and members of Parliament would talk about an organized international trade in young women as though it were a constant, sprawling, well-evidenced threat. So here's where this episode is going. First, how does one contract, one hiring office, and one hotel in New York become a national panic that lasts 3 decades? Second, when a historian finally went looking, more than a century later, for the evidence behind that panic, what did she actually find? And third, maybe the more uncomfortable question. While Copenhagen was busy being afraid of what was happening to its women abroad, what exactly was happening to women at home in a system the city had built, registered, and run itself? If you like global true crime told like a documentary, this is EnterTheCrime, and you might want to subscribe, because this one has more layers than most. But to understand how a single employment contract turned into a parliamentary debate, and how that debate turned into a 30-year panic, we have to go back to Copenhagen before any of this happened, to a city that was growing fast, and to a system it had already built, in plain sight, for managing exactly the kind of problem it would later claim to be importing from abroad. Let's start with where we are. Copenhagen, in the final decades of the 19th century, is the capital of Denmark, a small kingdom on the northern edge of Europe, made up of the Jutland Peninsula and a scatter of islands in the strait between the North Sea and the Baltic. Copenhagen itself sits on the island of Zealand, facing Sweden across a channel narrow enough to see across on a clear day. By the 1880s, it's a city in the middle of a population boom. Farm labourers, young, unmarried women especially, are arriving from the countryside in growing numbers, looking for work in a city that's industrializing but still runs, to a large degree, on domestic labor. For a young woman with little money and no trade, domestic service is close to the only respectable option available. She becomes a tjenestepige, a maid, a servant, living inside her employer's household, under a body of regulation known as the Tjendelov, the Servant Act, rules, dating back to the 18th century and repeatedly revised, governing nearly every part of the relationship between servants and the people who employed them, wages, notice periods, discipline, even where a servant was permitted to live. By modern standards, it's a deeply unequal arrangement. And the people who matched servants to households, festekontorer, hiring offices that, for a fee, connected job seekers with employers, operated with very little oversight. Some of these offices placed servants locally. Some placed them in other Danish cities. And some placed them abroad. Now here's the part of 1880s Copenhagen that the white slave trade panic would later studiously avoid discussing in the same breath. Copenhagen, like most major European cities of the period, ran what was called reglementeret prostitution, regulated prostitution. Under this system, women working as prostitutes were required to register with the police. Once registered, they were subject to compulsory, recurring medical examinations carried out by a branch of the police known as the Sundhedspolitiet, the health police, officially to control the spread of venereal disease. In exchange, registered women and registered brothels were permitted to operate without most legal consequences. I want to be precise about what this actually was, because it matters for everything that follows. This was a state-administered framework in which the government formally classified certain women as prostitutes, kept official records on them, and subjected their bodies, not their clients, to compulsory, repeated inspection. The men who used these women's services faced none of this. Critics, and there were plenty, argued that the system amounted to the state licensing the sexual use of poor women's bodies, while doing nothing about why those women ended up there in the first place. Through the 1880s, this system sat at the center of a furious public argument in Denmark, often called the sædelighedsfejden, the morality feud. It pulled in some of the biggest names in Scandinavian letters. Writers associated with what's now called the modern breakthrough, Denmark's wing of a broader Scandinavian literary movement that included the critic George Brandes, argued publicly about double standards in sexual morality, about whether men and women should be held to the same standard, and about what a system like reglementeret prostitution said about a society that claimed to prize women's virtue while running a licensing scheme for its violation. It was a loud, ongoing, distinctly Danish argument. And, worth sitting with, it was happening in Copenhagen, about Copenhagen, at the exact same time the city's hiring officers were quietly sending young women to take up domestic positions overseas. One of those young women was Marie Halversdatter. 19 years old in November 1880, she was, as far as the surviving record shows, an entirely ordinary case, a young woman looking for paid work, in a labor market where paid work for a teenage girl meant, overwhelmingly, domestic service. Another was Johan Hilda Fredriksson, Swedish, working in Copenhagen hotels, the kind of cross-border labor movement that was completely unremarkable in a region where Sweden was a short boat ride away. Neither of them appears in any history book as a name anyone was supposed to remember. They appear in a police file because of what happened next. On November 11, 1880, Marie Halversdatter signed a contract. It's a short document, the kind a Copenhagen hiring office would have processed dozens of times that year without a second thought. She agreed to serve as a tjenestepige, a maid, for a Miss R. Johnson, of Bleecker Street, numbers 22 and 24, New York. 6 months' service, beginning from her arrival in New York. 10 kroner a month. Her passage to New York, paid by Miss Johnson. On paper, it's nothing. It's the same kind of arrangement that, by the thousands, sent young Scandinavian women into domestic service in America during this period, into what recruitment language of the time liked to call trygge amerikanske hjem, safe American homes. Reading the contract cold, there's no reason to think it's any different from the rest. That's the moment everything changes. So let's talk about what actually happened to this case, because from here, the story stops being about Regina Johnson, and starts being about Denmark. Reversal 1. The initial framing, that these were just a handful of servant girls who'd gotten themselves into an unfortunate situation, the kind of thing landladies described with a shrug and the phrase lose par traden, didn't survive contact with what happened in New York. Regina Johnson was prosecuted in the United States. She was convicted, and she served a prison sentence there. That's not in dispute, and it's not a presumption, it's a documented outcome. An American court looked at what she had been doing on Bleecker Street and decided it was a crime, with a custodial sentence attached. And once that happened, the story stopped being a quiet police file. It became a scandal. Sagen vakte genled. As the Danish phrase goes, the case caused an echo, a reverberation, loud enough to reach Denmark's national parliament, the Folketing, the directly elected chamber of Denmark's two-house legislature at the time. Members of Parliament debated what had happened to Marie Halversdatter, Johan Hilda Fredriksson, and the others. Out of that debate came 2 concrete changes, an amendment to the Tjendelov, the servant law, and tighter government supervision of the Festkontorer, the hiring officers, of the kind that had processed that contract back in November 1880. If you're keeping score, this is, by any reasonable standard, a success story. A real abuse was identified. A real perpetrator was punished, abroad, but punished. And the Danish legal system responded with an actual change in the law. If this were a typical true crime episode, this might be close to where it ends. It isn't where it ends. Because here's reversal too. The assumption, reasonable, at the time, was that this had been dealt with. New oversight of hiring officers. An amended servant law. A convicted operator in an American prison. Problem identified. Problem addressed. Except, in the words the historical record itself uses, the demand for fresh young flesh continued. Whatever had been happening through that one hiring office in 1880 was evidently not unique to that office. And by the final years of the 1890s, something else was happening too. The issue of the white slave trade was becoming international, organized, and, this is the important word, political, in a way that had very little to do with any specific new Danish case. In 1898 and 1899, the Secretary of Britain's National Vigilance Society, a moral reform organization formed in the aftermath of a notorious 1885 London scandal involving child prostitution, toured European capitals, including Copenhagen, building support for what became the first international congress on the white slave trade, held in London in 1899. Governments across Europe, Denmark among them, were reportedly receptive. Out of this international momentum came, in 1902, a new Danish organization, Den Danske Committee til Bekæmpelse af den Hvide Slavehandel, the Danish Committee for the Suppression of the White Slave Trade. It was modeled on a French organization whose name translates roughly as the Friends of the Young Girl, and it positioned itself as Denmark's branch of an international anti-trafficking network. Denmark went on to sign international conventions against trafficking in women and children in both 1904 and 1910. So, in 20 years, the white slave trade went from one documented police file about one hiring office to a topic with its own dedicated national committee, its own international diplomatic conferences, and its own treaties. That's a massive escalation. And here's the question I want you to sit with, because we're coming back to it. What was the actual evidence, in Denmark, across those 20 years, that justified that escalation? Here's a way to think about it. If you'd picked up a Copenhagen newspaper in 1909, say, the paper called Aftenbladet, on March 31st of that year, you'd have read about the committee's latest annual report, full of cases of young Danish women being targeted by traffickers. So here's a question for you, and genuinely, take a guess before I tell you the answer. Across the full 55 years this panic was active in Denmark, roughly 1870 to 1925, how many actual documented cases do you think exist in the historical record? Drop a number in the comments. I'll give you the real figure in a few minutes, and I think it'll surprise you either way. For now, let's look at what that 1909 report actually contained, because it's a good snapshot of what a white slave trade case meant to the committee, in practice, by this point. The report described 3 cases from the previous year. The first, a 17-year-old girl had left for New York with her boyfriend, without her parents' knowledge or consent. At the parents' request, and because the committee judged it appropriate given the circumstances, they arranged for her to be sent straight back to Denmark when the ship docked in New York. The second, a young woman lodging in Copenhagen was, according to the report, pressured by her landlady to take up prostitution. When she refused, the landlady allegedly tried to arrange for her to be sent to Riga, a port city on the eastern Baltic coast, then part of the Russian Empire, today the capital of Latvia, under the promise of an excellent position waiting for her immediately. To make this happen, the landlady reportedly persuaded Copenhagen's passport office to issue travel documents by claiming to be the girl's mother. The girl's sister stopped the departure at the last possible moment. The committee reported the matter to police, who confiscated the passport. The third, 2 16-year-old girls in Copenhagen were, according to the report, lured to Malmö, a Swedish port city directly across the strait from Copenhagen, close enough to see from the Danish coast on a clear day, by men the report described using the Danish term levermand, which translates roughly as men who live off others. In plainer language, pimps. This happened, according to the report, without the girl's parents' knowledge or consent. I want to be fair to what this report is and isn't. These are real situations. An elopement serious enough that two sets of parents involved a national committee, a landlady allegedly attempting coercion and document fraud to ship a lodger abroad when she refused to work as a prostitute, two teenagers lured across a narrow strait by men with apparently exploitative intentions. None of this is nothing. The landlady case in particular, if the report's account is accurate, describes exactly the kind of coercion and fraud a white slave trade framework was designed to catch. But look at the geography. New York and a runaway boyfriend. A Copenhagen landlady and a half-day's travel to Riga. Malmö, 20 minutes away by boat. These are not the imagined transcontinental syndicates of the contemporary press, organized international gangs running industrial-scale shipments of Danish girls to brothels in Buenos Aires, Moscow, or Shanghai, the kind of claim circulating in the very same newspapers that ran this report. What we actually have, mostly, are local and regional situations, elopements, predatory landladies, opportunistic local men, and one teenage cross-border trip to a city most Copenhagenists visited for a weekend. Now, reversal 3. Here's the number I asked you to guess. In 2009, the historian Agnete Berger Madsen published a study, commissioned through Denmark's Women's Museum, that did something nobody had really done before. She went through 55 years of Danish records, newspapers, police files, committee reports, all of it, from 1870 to 1925, looking for documented cases of the white slave trade. She found 48 stories, across 55 years. That's less than one a year. For an entire era's worth of national committees, parliamentary debate, international conventions, newspaper campaigns, and, as we're about to see, some of the most commercially successful Danish films of the era. Madsen's conclusion wasn't that nothing happened. It was something more interesting, that the white slave trade, in early 20th century Denmark, was, in her framing, about sexuality, about morality, about the women's movement, and about politics, all at once. Philanthropic organizations used it. Newspapers used it. Politicians used it. Ordinary people used it. Everyone had a reason to talk about this particular threat, and the threat itself, as a documented phenomenon, was almost vanishingly small. By 1910, this gap, between a panic with national institutions behind it and an evidence base you could fit on 2 sheets of paper, found its biggest stage yet. Not in a courtroom. Not in a committee report. On a cinema screen. In April 1910, a film studio based in Aarhus, Fotorama, released a film called Den Hvide Slavehandel, directed by Alfred Kohn. At roughly 40 minutes and around 706 meters of film, it was, at the time, the longest film ever made in Denmark. 4 months later, in August 1910, Denmark's dominant film company, Nordisk Film, released its own version, also called Den Hvide Slavehandel, directed by August Blom, running about 4 to 5 minutes. Nordisk's version wasn't a sequel or a parody. It was, essentially, a direct competitor telling close to the same story, which tells you something about how saturated the cultural moment already was with this exact narrative. And what was that narrative? In both films, a poor but respectable young Danish woman named Anna answers a newspaper advertisement for a well-paid position as a lady's companion in a wealthy household. In London. She travels to a Copenhagen hotel for the interview, gets the job, and sets off for England, over the doubts of her fiancé. On arrival, she's delivered not to a respectable household but to a luxury brothel. She manages to fight off her first client. She's eventually rescued, in Nordisk's version, after a car chase, with help from her fiancé and Scotland Yard, the popular name for the detective branch of London's Metropolitan Police. If that plot sounds familiar, it should. It's almost a shot-for-shot inversion of the actual 1880 case we started with, except every detail has been relocated somewhere more dramatically convenient. The real case involved a contract for domestic service in New York, arranged through an ordinary Copenhagen hiring office, ending in a brothel on Bleecker Street, uncovered through police statements about landladies and hotel keepers. The films involve a newspaper advertisement, a ladies' companion position in London, a luxury brothel, and a rescue involving a car chase and Scotland Yard. Same shape, completely different texture, and, notably, a foreign villain, London, this time, not New York, and an ending where the system works. The heroine is saved, the institutions function, justice arrives in the form of famous foreign police. Commercially, Nordisk's film was a sensation. It sold 103 copies worldwide, against an average of around 40 copies for a 1910 release. That's not a modest hit. That's one of the most commercially successful Danish films of the entire silent era, on a subject that, according to Agnete Berger Madsen's later research, represented something like one documented Danish case every 14 months. Nordisk's success didn't go unnoticed. The studio produced 2 sequels, Den Hvide Slavehandel 2, released in 1911, and a 3rd installment in 1912, turning what had started as a moral panic into, quite literally, a film franchise. Other Danish productions followed the same template through the decade. By this point, the white slave trade wasn't just a political cause. It was a genre. And here's the detail I find genuinely strange. American censors wouldn't allow Nordisk's film to be shown in the United States. Not because it endorsed trafficking. The film is unambiguously a cautionary tale, with a virtuous heroine and a rescue-driven happy ending. The censors objected to the brothel scenes themselves, to the way the film depicted the world its heroine was trapped in, regardless of the moral framing wrapped around them. A film whose entire message was this should not happen was banned in America for showing, too vividly, the thing that should not happen. So here's where I want to offer a reframing, the kind of thing that, once you see it, changes how the rest of this story reads. Go back to 1906. That's the year Denmark abolished reglementeret prostitution, the system of registered brothels and compulsory medical inspection that had been the subject of that furious public argument, the sædelighedsfejden, through the 1880s and into the 1890s. For decades, Copenhagen had operated a state system that formally classified certain women as prostitutes and subjected their bodies, not their clients, to recurring, compulsory examination by the police. A system that critics had spent years arguing amounted to state-organized exploitation of poor women dressed in the language of public health. And in 1906, right in the middle of the years when the white slave trade panic was building toward its 1909 committee reports and its 1910 cinema peak, that system was dismantled. Here's the reframing. What if the white slave trade and reglementeret prostitution weren't 2 separate problems that happened to be unfolding in Denmark at the same time? What if they were, in a real sense, the same problem, the sexual economy surrounding poor, young, often very young women with very few alternatives, viewed through 2 completely different lenses? One lens, reglementeret prostitution, looked at that economy directly, at home, in Copenhagen, and forced an uncomfortable question. What is the state's relationship to a system it has built and licensed? That question produced decades of bitter argument and, eventually, abolition. The other lens, Den Hvide Slavehandel, looked at almost the same underlying economy, but relocated it abroad, New York, London, Riga, Buenos Aires, Moscow. It staffed that economy with foreign or semi-foreign villains, a Miss R. Johnson, London brothel keepers, men placing newspaper advertisements, and it gave its heroines a description that mattered enormously. Poor but honorable, from good homes, virtuous by definition, victims by misfortune rather than circumstance. That version of the story didn't require anyone in Copenhagen to ask what the state itself had been doing. It let everyone, reformers, churches, newspapers, members of parliament, audiences buying tickets to a 4 to 5 minute drama, agree on a villain, feel something, and go home. I'm not saying the 1881 Regina Johnson case was fake, or that the 1909 committee report was fabricated, or that no Danish woman was ever genuinely trafficked in this period. The documented cases are real. What I am saying is that the size of the public reaction, the committees, the conventions, the parliamentary debates, the best-selling Danish film franchise of the era, bears almost no relationship to the size of the documented problem. And the gap between those two things had to be filled with something. In Denmark, in this period, it got filled with a story about a foreign brothel, a fake job advertisement, and a rescue by Scotland Yard. That story was easier to tell than the one about Copenhagen's own licensed brothels, its own health police, and its own register of women's names. So what happened to all of this, the committees, the conventions, the law, after 1910? That's the last piece. Denmark had signed international conventions against trafficking in women and children in 1904 and 1910, and a third followed in 1923. All three were eventually ratified by Denmark in 1931, after being folded into the country's new comprehensive criminal code, the Borgerlig Straffelov, the Civil Penal Code, of 1930. The 1910 convention specifically criminalized recruiting, abducting, or luring women for what the law called immoral purposes, and for women under 20, this applied even if the woman knew what she was being recruited for and agreed to it. With that, the white slave trade, den Hvide Slavehandel, became, formally, a category in international law. Not just a newspaper phrase. A legal one. And then, gradually, the phrase itself disappeared. Den Hvide Slavehandel faded from use over the following decades, replaced eventually by a more clinical, more international vocabulary. Trafficking. Menneskehandel. Denmark wrote a dedicated trafficking offense into its criminal code in 2002, over 90 years after the conventions that first established the concept, and well over a century after that contract was signed on Bleecker Street. Here's the part that, for me, earns this episode its place on this channel. In the mid-2000s, researchers connected to Denmark's Women's Museum, the same institution that later commissioned Agnete Berger Madsen's study of those 48 cases, went back to the Regina Johnson file. Not as history. As a template. Because, as the museum's researchers pointed out at the time, the basic shape of the 1880 case, young women recruited with promises of safe, paid positions abroad, only to be delivered into brothels, is structurally identical to patterns documented in Denmark in the 21st century, involving women recruited from Eastern Europe with promises of work as, for example, dancers or au pairs, who end up in brothels in Western Europe, Denmark included. And the gap between public concern and documented prosecution? That pattern held too. A 2008 report from Denmark's National Police found that 23 trafficking charges had been filed the previous year. Of those 23, 8 resulted in some kind of formal finding against the accused, and that figure includes outcomes like fines and negotiated drop charge settlements, not only convictions after trial. Asked about it directly, Copenhagen's police director could name only 2 cases from that year that had actually resulted in conviction. 23 charges. 2 convictions. 127 years after Copenhagen, Clark wrote down that a runaway servant girl was Lou's pa traden. I don't think this story has a villain in the way true crime stories usually want one. Regina Johnson is the closest thing to it, and she was caught, tried, and imprisoned, in another country, for running an operation that, by any standard, deserved exactly that outcome. Everyone else in this story, the landladies, the levemand, the committee members, the censors, the audiences who bought 103 copies of a 4 to 5 minute film, was responding, in their own way, to something real. They just weren't always responding to the thing the documented record actually shows. The contract Marie Halversdatter signed on November 11, 1880, promised her 10 kroner a month, and her passage paid. 145 years later, the promises sound different. A dancing job, an au pair position, a company lady role in a London household that, on a movie screen at least, turns out to have a happy ending. The promises changed. So, twice now, has the law. What hasn't changed, in either century, is the size of the gap between how loudly a society talks about this problem and how often it actually convicts anyone for it. If you're into true crime documentaries that dig into the history and the politics behind the headlines, subscribe to Enter the Crime and let us know in the comments. How many documented cases did you guess before we gave you the real number?